In our first week, we got oriented with the clinical trial process, and we also talked about the data management plan. Our next lecture is going to be on case report form design. So let's go over our learning objectives. First, we're going to discuss the elements of CRF design. Then we'll identify the components of a CRF. We'll discuss how CRFs are completed, and by that I mean filled out, completed by the site staff. And then we'll go over and cite some common errors that we see in CRF forms. So we'll get a chance to go over all of these in the coming lecture. So first of all, what is a case report form or a CRF? The case report form is a data reporting document that's used in a clinical study. So it's our primary instrument for collecting clinical data that the site is going to collect when the patients come in for their visits. It also collects the study data in a standardized format, which is going to be according to the protocol and is also going to comply with regulatory requirements and is going to allow us to collect it in an efficient so that it can be allowing for efficient analysis. So every piece of data that we collect on a case report form is going to wind up in our patient casebook, and it's going to be the primary data that makes up our clinical database data set that is then analyzed by our biostatisticians. So remaining on that same thread of what is a case report form, it allows for efficient and complete data collection, processing, and analysis and reporting. And then it facilitates the exchange of data across projects and organizations, especially through standardization. Some of these types might be paper or might be an electronic data capture system or a web interface system. And we're going to go over some of these as we progress in the course. But a good case report form allows us to utilize some of these standardization methods to make our job a little easier and to hopefully make our trial run a little smoother. And then we're also, the case report form is also accompanied by completion guidelines or instructions that explain to the site how they should fill them out or how they should report and enter certain data that they collect. So good CRF design or standard CRFs allow for rapid data exchange. They also remove the need for mapping during data exchange. They allow for consistent reporting across protocols and across projects. Most protocols that we work on are going to be part of an overall program, and in many cases they're going to be collecting, or we're going to be collecting the same type of data across multiple protocols. So standardizing CRFs help us to facilitate that. And then it also promotes monitoring and investigator staff efficiency. So the better our site staff, clinical site staff, is able to understand our CRFs and understand how they're to record the data that they collect for patients when they come in for visits, it makes our monitor's job a lot easier when they go out and do their source data verification. They also allow us to merge data between studies. And then finally, they provide an increased efficiency in processing and analysis of clinical data. So during the course of our trial, we're going to be reviewing a lot of data. We're going to be reviewing a lot of discrepancies, and the better prepared the CRFs are, hopefully the fewer mistakes will be made at the site, and hopefully they can cut down on the number of discrepancies and the number of queries that we have to use in order to clean that data during the course of the trial. So let's talk about some general considerations for case report form development. First of all, we want to develop our CRFs to collect data with all the users in mind. Now, all the users would include people that work at the clinical site staff. It would also be monitors who are going to go out and source data verify the information that's collected, the data that's collected. It's also going to be people that work in data management or work in biostatistics. So we need to keep all these people in mind, all these types of roles in mind as we're creating and as we're developing our CRFs. We also want to collect data that's going to be required by regulatory agencies. We're going to see some examples of those as we progress in the class. But we do need to make sure that we collect all the data that we're required to collect by whatever regulatory agency we're going to be submitting our results to. We're also going to make sure we collect the data that's outlined in the protocol. The protocol is going to provide us, going to tell us what data should be collected. And then finally, we want to be clear and concise with our data questions. So we want to make it as easy as possible for the site to record the correct data that they're supposed to enter into a specific data field. Continuing along the general considerations, we want to make sure that we avoid duplication. We don't want to enter the same data more than once. We want to enter it one time in one location. That makes it a lot easier to avoid entering the wrong data as we go along. We also want to have minimal free text responses. We really want to collect actual data that can be counted, that can be quantified, that can be subject to analysis, and in many cases, free text responses do not allow us to do that. So as we go along and look at some of the examples, that'll make a little bit more sense to you. Also, we want to collect data in a fashion that allows for the most efficient computerization. As we get into some discussion of some of the dictionaries that we use in order to standardize some of the data elements, this will come into play. And then finally, we want to allow for similar data to be collected across studies. As we said earlier, and many times we're going to be working on clinical studies or protocols that are across an entire program. So we may have, for example, 10 or 12 phase 3 trials that are part of a program, and we want to make that data as consistent as possible. So let's take a look at the elements of a case report form. The term CRF, or case report form, indicates a single page. So a series of CRF pages makes up either a CRF book or a case book. Now each patient is going to have a case book. So that case book is going to consist of the CRF pages that are collected, the data that's entered at each visit, whether it's the screening visit or as they progress on through to the final visit or an early termination visit. All of the data collected on all of the CRF pages are contained in the patient casebook. So, each patient is going to have one casebook during the course of our clinical trial. One CRF book is going to be completed for each subject that's enrolled in a study. The CRF is going to have three major parts. There's going to be a header, there's going to be some safety related modules, and there's going to be efficacy related modules. And I will go over those as we go along. The first module that we mentioned in the previous slide was the header information. This is going to consist of key identifying information. So there's a few pieces of information that we absolutely must have on there. First of all, we need the study number, or this may be referred to as the protocol number. That number should appear on every single CRF page in our casebook. That way, in case they're ever misplaced, or they're out of order, or something may happen to them in the case of a paper CRF, we can automatically very quickly identify which study and which patient it goes to. Also, you would have the site number. This would be the clinical site for that patient goes to for their visits, and you either have a site or a center number on there. And then you would also have the subject identification number. We may refer to this as a CRF ID. But this would be a number that identifies that unique patient that's enrolled in our trial. Ordinarily, at the site, they would maintain a log of all the subject identification numbers and then the names of those subjects that they would maintain at the site, so they would be able to know which subject was whom. The only people that are going to see that are going to be the people at the site. They do not send that in to the sponsor. They don't send it into the CRO. That is private health information that needs to remain at the site. But they do need to maintain that so that they can identify and match up a subject identification number with a specific subject. The next component of the CRF is going to be the safety modules. And as we complete these, as we create these, we want to keep the safety analysis requirements of the protocol in mind. Every protocol is going to have safety endpoints, and that's going to be data that's going to be critical for indicating whether or not the patient's safety is at risk in a specific trial. For some trials, it may include ECG data, such as a QTC interval reading, at or above a certain level. That may be a key safety threshold that once the patient gets close to that threshold or gets over it, we need to do some serious evaluation of whether or not that patient should continue in the trial. We also are going to make sure that we follow the general guidelines for CRF development, those guidelines that we've talked about earlier. Some of the safety modules are going to include demographic information. That could be age, could be gender, could be the race of the individual, of the subject. Also adverse events. We're going to be collecting a lot of adverse events during the course of our trial, so those are going to be part of the safety modules. We're also going to have medical history that's going to be taken at the beginning of the trial, so we have a view of what the patient's medical baseline is. We'll also have a physical exam that they'll undergo. That'll include vital signs. It'll include an examination of their body. We'll also collect concomitant or concurrent medications, and this could also include medical procedures that they experience or they have during the course of a trial. Safety modules also include death. In case a patient dies, there's going to be a page that collects information related to the death. We're also going to keep track of any dropouts or any of those that are lost to follow-up, that they came in for their visit and then we never heard from them again. It's also going to contain eligibility information. So we've got inclusion-exclusion criteria data that makes up our safety modules. And then the third element is going to be our efficacy modules. Now, these are considered to be unique modules and can be a little more difficult to develop, but these are going to be the modules that collect the data related to our primary and secondary efficacy endpoints. Now, the protocol is going to dictate the elements that are required in the efficacy model. So a couple of these might include key efficacy endpoints for the trial, both primary and secondary. We may have additional test measures that would apply to efficacy, such as the patient's response to a quality of life survey or some quality of life questions. We also may collect data that on how lesions will be measured, whether they're the longest diameter or they're bi-dimensional. Regardless of how we're going to do that, we'll probably have some information about that. It's also going to include what required diagnostics are necessary for our trial. These could include lab reports, ECGs. There could be other diagnostic reports that are required, and we're going to collect that data during the course of our trial. It's also going to include appropriate baseline measurements, and then it's going to repeat the same battery of tests. So for example, we may have patients come in that may be set up on a schedule to come in, say, once a month, and they may have a lab draw during the month that they come in. And then the lab data, the results of that lab data, then provides us with key efficacy data that we might want to analyze over the course of a trial for each patient. So those could be examples of the type of data that's contained in our efficacy modules. So there are all kinds of guidelines and regulations that are associated with clinical trials. And some of these we'll get into as we go along. But one of the big ones is going to be our good clinical practice guidelines that are made up of our ICH, GCP. ICH is the International Conference on Harmonization, and that conference produces good clinical practice guidelines that we need to be mindful of as we're creating our CRFs. So I've listed a few of them here: trial management and data handling and record keeping. You can see the sections that they apply to. We also have subject and data confidentiality. There are certain patient data that we do not collect during the course of a trial and don't become part of the casebook. And that section 2.11 and then section 5.53 of the ICH Good Clinical Practice E6 guideline, that's where that's located. You can quickly Google these and you can find the guidelines online. Also, we've got safety reporting. We have quality control guidelines. We have guidelines that are related to records and reporting, how long we're supposed to keep records. Also, how we're supposed to report certain pieces of data, for example, adverse event data. There are regulations or guidelines for sites to report that to the sponsor. And then there's also guidelines for the sponsor reporting those to the regulatory authorities. And then finally, we've got monitoring guidelines and regulations that are associated with our trial as well. Remaining on the thread of guidelines and regulations, a big one that applies to data management is going to be 21 CFR Part 11. 21 refers to Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations. That is going to be the FDA regulations that govern how we conduct clinical trials. So in 21 CFR Part 11, that applies to all data residing at the institutional site and the sponsor's site, and also in the database. So it's created an electronic record that's going to be submitted to the FDA for analysis, and then hopefully we're going to win marketing approval once that analysis is complete. So the scope of these guidelines cover how you validate databases, the guidelines for audit trails, for corrections in the database, for accounting, for legacy systems, also for copies of records, and also record retention. So clinical sites are going to complete the case report form, so they're going to fill them out. Imagine that it's a form on a piece of paper. That's probably the easiest way to think of it. And then according to Good Clinical Practice section 4.9.1, this is contained in the International Conference on Harmonization E6 guideline. You can look that up on the internet if you want to. The investigator should ensure that the accuracy, completeness, legibility, and timeliness of the data reported on the CRFs and in all required reports. Now, these would be this includes ensuring that all sections have been completed, including the header with any identifying items. All alterations have been made properly, that all adverse events are fully recorded, and that all serious adverse events, any specific documentation has been completed. So this is going to govern how we're going to complete these CRFs while the site is as they're conducting the trial. So the manner in which our CRFs are going to be completed is that we're going to take data from the source documents, for example, the medical record, and then we're going to enter that data onto the CRFs. The study personnel is going to do that. Then this is referred as data abstraction. The only designated members of the research site should be allowed to record and/or correct data in the CRFs. So when we go to the site, when the monitor goes to the site, we're going to analyze the delegation of authority and find out which research site members are able to record data onto the CRFs. And we're going to make sure that only those people do it. Typically, this is a responsibility that resides with the coordinator or maybe a research nurse. So some tips for CRF completion. CRF completion should be observed to ensure that accuracy, completeness, legibility, and timeliness of the data is reported to the sponsor. And then we want to make sure that appropriate protocol, investigator, and subject identifying information is included in the header. So for some remote data capture studies, this information may already be pre-populated in the screen. If you're working on a paper study, you may see some of this information that's already printed on the form itself, so we don't have to enter that each time ourselves. And then we also want to ensure that data is entered in the correct location or the data field. So we want to make sure we use appropriate units of measure and that we're consistent throughout as we do that. That's not only consistent with the same patient, but consistent across all the patients that we have at our site. We want to check to see that data is consistent across data fields and across CRFs. For example, we're going to make sure that the visit dates match the dates on the laboratory or other procedure reports. So that'd be a quick way to kind of verify that the data hopefully is coming from the same source. We want to make sure that the birth date matches the subject's age. And then we only want to use abbreviations that are authorized per completion or instruction manual. So in many cases, a sponsor will authorize the site to use certain abbreviations when necessary. So you will usually keep a list of the ones they're authorized to use. Then we want to double check our spelling on these CRFs. Some other completion tips. We want to watch for transcription errors. A good example is, let's say the site enters the sodium level as 135, when in fact it should be 150, or it's entered as 153. That could be enough of an outer range value on that to cause a query to fire. So we want to watch for those kinds of errors and see if we can correct them before they get made. We also do not allow entries to run outside the indicated data field. So this is important because we might miss, some of the data might be missed during the data processing. Normally, and we'll see these in a moment, the CRF page is going to have boxes or little blocks where you would enter a number, or maybe you would check a box or something like that. So we try to make it as easy as possible. Then we want to use the comment sections to elaborate on any information. We want to keep that to the minimum. Remember, I told you earlier, we want to limit the number of free text fields that we're working with in our database. So ideally, we should complete the CRF, or the site should complete the CRF as soon as possible after the subject's visit, hopefully either that day or maybe within a day or two of that visit, while the information related to that visit is very fresh in the site staff's mind. We also want to ensure that information can be retrieved or followed up on while the visit is still fresh in our minds and while the subject and information is still easily accessible. Sometimes it may be necessary to call the patient just to clarify something. So we want to do that as soon as possible after the visit, because the patient may forget certain things, after a few days or after a week or two goes by. Some important reminders. Data cannot be entered onto a CRF if it is not in the medical record or some other source document that is there for the patient. So it might be a lab report or some other document, but we cannot enter any data unless it appears on some type of source, because we've got to be able to verify that. If the individual completing the CRF finds missing or discrepant source data, here's what they should do. They should notify the research nurse or the healthcare provider, who will then provide the data. And then, if applicable, they may have to contact an outside source, such as a lab or some other area of the clinic that may have data that they need for their trial. So these are some common errors that we see when sites start entering data into the database. We find errors that are logical. In other words, the date of the second visit is earlier than the first visit. That possibly couldn't possibly be correct. So there's a logic error. We've got inaccurate information, a source document that says one thing and a CRF that says another. So on the source document, it says the patient's blood pressure was 130/95. Then on the CRF page, it says the patient's blood pressure was 120/80. So we'd want to make sure we query the site about that and find out which one is indeed the correct value. We may have some omissions. Adverse event is recorded on the CRF, but not on the source document. So that would be an example of where our source data verification, finds those things, those kinds of omissions. And then finally, we've got transcription errors, where, in the case we see here, the date is November 2nd, 1959, instead of February 11th, 1959. So we can sometimes get those numbers in reverse order, and then we've got some transcription errors. Moving on with common errors, we might see abbreviations. Sometimes these might be abbreviations that we're not familiar with, so that can be an error that causes us to have to either send a query or contact the site to follow up on it. And unless an approved list of abbreviations is distributed, usually data entry personnel, can't often misinterpret abbreviations. We've got spelling errors. Those occur all the time. We have illegible entries, where we may have write-overs where they scratched out one response and wrote over it. So these are some of the errors that we see. And then we also see them writing in the margins of the CRF page. So it's important that the site understand that when they've got a CRF page and they have a block where they're supposed to enter a value for what the patient got there, either in the lab or through the course of their examination, that we make sure we don't have any write-overs, and we don't have that written in the margins. We want to keep it within those boxes where we're supposed to record the data. So if we're correcting mistakes made to a paper CRF, we want to see if we can do the following items. So we want to draw one horizontal line through the error, and then we're going to insert the correct data, and then we'll initial and date the change. That way everyone will know when that change was made and who made it. We do not want to erase, scribble out, or use correction fluid or any other means which could obscure the original entry. So we don't want to just completely mark it out. We want to just line through it so that we can see what it was. And that helps provide an audit trail for these updates as we go along. So for our electronic data collection process, this would be where sites actually have access to the clinical database and can enter data directly to the database. A couple of elements of this is it's going to be web-based interface, so they can get to it from any place. It's going to be sponsor or site dependent. It ensures data integrity because we control the ability to delete or alter previously entered data. It also helps provide an audit trail for the data changes. We know who made the change, when they did it, and what the change was. And then it also protects the database from being tampered with. And then it finally ensures data preservation. So, for example, we can get automatic backups. So that way we won't lose any of that data in case there's some kind of crash or something like that. So now we're going to take a look at some CRF examples, and I like to call this the good, the bad, and the ugly. Some of the samples, some of the examples are actually pretty good. There's some that aren't so good, and we'll go over those and talk about those. And some of them are kind of ugly. So we want to make sure that we avoid some of the mistakes that we'll see in some of these. Okay, the first example that we're going to look at is where we're actually entering the same data more than once. So if you look at figure 2.2 on page 15 of your book, you'll see an example of this. As you can see from the box there, from the table, the start and stop times are the same for the previous line. And so this, the way they've got it set up here, it makes us have to enter the same information more than once. And so that can easily cause us to enter some data that happens to be wrong. Here's an example of a CRF page that at first glance looks pretty normal. However, we'll talk about a few of the issues with it. This would be an example of ambiguous versus unambiguous data. So if we were to see this particular information in a CRF page, so we've got the first column there, symptom, we've got redness, swelling, heat, discharge, and then over to the right we have a box that says check if present. So at first glance that looks like it's pretty straightforward. If they don't have any redness, then we wouldn't check that. If they did, then we would. The problem that presents is that when somebody back at our sponsor company reviews that, number one, they don't know if it was just skipped entirely, which it could have been. So this is an example of ambiguous data. We think that it wasn't present because it isn't checked. However, we can't be sure because there's no way to find out about that based on what we've collected here. So here's an example of a case report form that might exist, and maybe this could be from a electronic data capture study. And as you can see across the top, there's information there for a country code or a center number. There's also information there for the patient's initials and also for the patient number. So remember, that would be part of the header information that we want to see across every CRF page that we work with. So as you can see, as we move down the first row there, first question is, did the patient sign the informed consent? Yes, no. All right, at first glance, that looks pretty good. It would be a lot better if we could have the site indicate what date the patient signed the form, and we might want them to include the time that they signed it, because in our clinical trial we have to make sure that a patient signs the consent form before they have any trial procedures done. So this would be a great place to collect that So we want to say patient signed informed consent, yes. Date they signed could be June 10th, 2014. We might want to put the time that we signed, or what would be even better would be a field that says patient signed consent form prior to completing any trial-specific procedures. Please check yes or no. Then if we look in the lower column, the next column there, column or row 2, excuse me, is the inclusion criteria. And then the next row, 3, includes our exclusion criteria. So for our inclusion criteria, we always want those to be yes. We want them answered yes. And then all of our exclusion criteria, we want them answered no, because the exclusion criteria is usually going to determine who gets to participate in a clinical trial. So we want that to be the correct responses of no. And then finally underneath there, you see where there's some demographic information being collected. And then down below, it indicates, you see row 5, physical exam. We've got a couple of pieces of information there. I want to point out that in that first date, or first section there, they have a date. They've already got the year 2000 something or other populated. So they have a 2 and a 0 and a 0. It's better if you leave those fields blank and then go ahead and let the site fill in what that date is. So that helps us use the same page. We won't have a situation where we can't use that page because some other piece of information like a date has already been pre-populated in there. So here's an example of a case report form that appears in an electronic data capture study. So as you can see up at the top, some of that information is already pre-populated into the database. For example, the date of birth. That's not going to change. So we're going to go ahead and enter that one time and then let that propagate throughout the CRF pages of the trial. And then as you see down below there, these are some inclusion criteria. Remember, we wanted to want to see yes answers for the inclusion criteria. If you notice down there on question number 8 at the bottom, it says, has the patient been properly informed of the study and signed the informed consents? We have yes or no written there, so that's a good use of that particular data set. One of the things that we have that are associated with case report forms are going to be case report form completion guidelines. Now these could be actual paper guidelines that are sent out to the site. And a lot of times in EDC studies, those guidelines actually exist within the database itself. So you might have maybe a help button or question mark that you can click, and it might give you some guidance on how to enter that particular piece of data. For paper studies, you may see these guidelines actually printed on the back of the CRF page itself. So that way we don't have to send out some additional document out to the site. So what you see on the screen here is an example of some of those instructions as they might exist. So you see these, the first note there says, all fields with a DBG will fire a discrepancy if a value is not in the code list. So a DBG is a discrete value group. So what that means is that there's going to be some type of little pull down menu for that particular data element. Think of it as when you go to Amazon and you order a book or you order something on there, and then you're typing in your shipping address, and you get to the section where it says state, and automatically it pulls up a list of all the states, and then you choose whichever one you're in. That would be an example of a discrete value group. And we like to use as many of those as we can because that kind of helps to standardize our data as we go along. This page would be an example of a concomitant medication page that we might fill out for a paper study. As you can see there in the first row, we would want to indicate the number, just 1, 2, 3, 4, and on down the list, and then what the name of the medication was. In this case, the example shows us that the aspirin is what the subject was taking. We enter a start date and an end date, and then we indicate whether or not it is ongoing, yes or no. So if there's an end date there, then we want to check ongoing no, because they're no longer taking it. If it's a medication that they take on a regular basis, you probably wouldn't have an end date. So it probably would be ongoing because they take it on a regular basis, probably to help with some chronic disease indication. Then the next column over, we're going to enter the dose, and we're going to enter the dose per day and the unit. In this case, they've indicated that 60 milligrams is the dose per day per unit. Then the next column is going to be the route. So that could be, it could be by mouth, PO, that's what that means. Could be intravenously. It could be an infusion. It could be some type of topical medication that you rubbed across your skin. So that could be any number of routes. And then the next column over is for indication. That's for the medical indication, the reason why the patient is taking that medication. And then the next column over is where we would enter either an adverse event number or in the column adjacent to it, a medical history number. So every concomitant medication that we collect and that we list on a CRF page has to be associated with either an adverse event or it has to be associated with an entry on the medical history page. So for example, in this particular example here, they've indicated that the subject is taking aspirin for, and they've indicated adverse event 2. So we had to go on the adverse event page and find out, what they were taking the aspirin for. Maybe it was a headache or a toothache or some other type of pain. And then we have that should match what's in the column marked indication. And then out here to the right, there's going to be times where patients take concomitant medications and they do it on a prophylaxis basis. So they do it to avoid some type of disease indication. So in this case, we want to indicate either yes or no. Is it taken for prophylaxis or is it not? So we mentioned the protocol, and we mentioned that the data elements, or the data that we're going to collect, comes from the protocol. In many cases, it comes from the schedule of procedures section in the protocol. So that's going to tell us what all is going to be done over the course of the trial, and it tells us what we need to collect as they go along. So here's an example of a schedule of events for the clinical trial for each patient. So as you can see over on the left-hand column, we have a number of criteria there. You'll see where it says informed consent, patient demographics, medical surgical history, current medications, and you'll notice that it has an X checked in the box for baseline visit. So that's when that particular activity is going to occur. So we're going to collect all their medical history at the baseline visit, their smoking status, their inclusion-exclusion criteria. And then once we collect that at the baseline visit, it's not necessary to collect the same information again. So if you look at the row across the top, you'll see where we've got the visits numbered. So it looks like this patient's going to come in for a 1-month visit, and then a 3-month visit, a 9-month visit, or a 6-month visit, a 9-month visit, a 12-month, and then so they're going to be on a regular visit schedule of every 3 months following their baseline visit. And then down there as we move down the listing here, it indicates to us which assessments are going to be done at which site, or during which visit, I mean. So if we look there, for example, where it has body weight, which is right there under physical examinations, it's the third item, third row on that list. You can see where we're going to check their body weight at the baseline visit, and then we're going to check it at the 6-month visit, 12-month visit, 18-month visit, and so on. And that may change because we may discover that it's not necessary to collect those things, collect that piece of data further into the trial. But this will indicate what activities are going to be collected at which visits. So that concludes our lecture on CRF Design. So for your Moodle assignment for this week, I want you to read Chapter 2 in Practical Guide to Clinical Data Management. Chapter 2 is CRF Design Considerations. And then on your discussion forum for this week, I'd like you to think about the following question. So based on what you've learned from the class lecture, from your reading, discuss 2 considerations that you think are most important that involve designing and working with case report forms, and why you think they are. So provide an example here. An example might be a strategy for avoiding transcription errors. When we're working with paper CRFs, we get quite a few of those where site staff fill out the CRF, and then whoever's going to enter that into the database may not be able to read what's written on there. They may not be able to make it out, and that can lead to some errors. So that might be an example of one of the things that you would think about. So think about that. Go ahead, get your response up there this week. I'll be taking a look at those, and of course your other classmates will be looking at it as well. So try to follow up on that as quickly as you can and get those out there, and I'll be looking for them later in the week. If you have any questions, certainly let me know. Use the questions to the instructor forum on Moodle, and I'll be on the lookout for those as well. So good luck to you, and I'll look for you on the discussion forum.